Lately, I've been grabbing this new Altenew product and using it on my watercolor cards more frequently. Basically, I've stopped using watercolor pan sets because of the versatility of this exciting medium. In this video, I'll show you 3 ways I use the new Altenew Woodless Watercolor Pencils. And of course, like all Altenew colors, they coordinate beautifully with pigments you already have in your stash. Like the name implies, these watercolor pencils are woodless, so that means the entire pencil is pigment except for the waxy outer coating. This enables you to hold the pencil without transferring pigment to your fingers. There are 24 colors in this set, and these color names should be familiar to you because they span other mediums within the Altenew family. Here on my swatch chart, you can see that these woodless watercolor pencils behave like both a colored pencil and a watercolor pan. I've tried many watercolor type pencils. What makes this pencil stand out for me is the ease of hydrating the dry pigment. Let's first take a look at my first project. I want to use the Altenew Woodless Watercolor Pencil like a colored pencil, but to no black outline color. For my first perfect pairing, I'm using the pencils with Altenew Build a Flower Begonia. I've already stamped the outline images in a faint water-soluble ink onto a panel of A2 loose watercolor sheets. To color these images, I'm taking my first woodless watercolor pencil and tracing the tips of the petals following the outline I have stamped on my watercolor paper. What I like about being able to put down dry pigment as the first step is there is color consistency throughout the flower. I don't know about you, but when you color one petal at a time, it's difficult to get consistent saturation throughout the flower unless you know how to work quickly with watercolor. I get to put down color throughout the flower first, so that then I can grab my watercolor brush and a cup of clean water to hydrate each petal. I'm using my watercolor brush to lightly make this scrubbing motion to lift the dry watercolor pigment and transform it to a wet suspension. Now I can use a paper towel to wipe off and diffuse the pigment to make a gradient on each petal. Like I said earlier, having the dry pigment laid down already and suspending each petal with water gives me a consistent value in each petal. Here's another trick. I dip the woodless watercolor pencil directly into my cup of clean water to put down a more intense saturation of color directly onto my paper. This time I'm applying Coral Bliss to the center of each petal for a more intense pink. Then I can use my brush to diffuse the pigment like the tips of the petals. I'll repeat this technique of putting down dry pigment, suspending the color, and diffusing the water for the other flower and a few of the leaves. To finish this card, I'll die cut all the flowers and foliage and arrange them on top of a panel of white cardstock. I used my favorite jet black ink spray to make this background by diluting a bit of the ink with water and using a fine-tipped water brush to add an array of splatters. Then I used 2 of the sentiment strips in Build a Flower Begonia and added them on top of the flowers. To glue down the flowers and sentiments, I used the new 2-in-1 precision glue pen from Altenew for easy application and strong adhesion between paper and paper. You'll see me use this pen for other projects in this video as well, so I keep it close by. I embellished this card with even more splatters, but this time I used pure white ink spray for a dewy look to the flowers and leaves. That finishes this first card example using the watercolor pencils like colored pencils for petal details and no outline coloring. Up next is this card using the Woodless Watercolor Pencils another way. As much as I love these pencils, I am still a traditional pan watercolor fan, so I'll use these pencils more like a pan pigment for intense color saturation, especially for yellows. I'll use the Altenew Paint a Flower Sunflower, A2 loose watercolor sheets, and Essential Sentiment Strips die set to make this card. I'll first stamp the outline flower bundle close to the center of my watercolor paper using Obsidian Pigment Ink. I know I'm going to trim this panel down, so I'm leaving a margin all around the paper. I let the pigment dry back before taking my Woodless watercolor pencils out. Like I mentioned earlier, even in my artist grade watercolors, yellow is a pigment I have difficulty resuspending in watercolor pans. With the Woodless watercolor pencils, I'm able to do quick swipes of this yellow watercolor pencil and apply really intense color directly onto my watercolor paper. I'll keep building layers of orange and amber for the petals and blues and greens for the leaves. Working up this painting took about 10 minutes, so it took me no time at all to make this loose watercolor sunflower panel. I'll add some purple splatters to this panel using the Woodless Watercolor Pencil and a fine-tipped water brush. I'm able to get intense purple splatters on top of my panel because the pigment is easy to resuspend. After drying that back, I decided to trim down this panel to be about 3.5 by 4 3/4, but with a deckled edge. In order to make my deckled edge more predictable, instead of just ripping the paper, I like to make light cuts with my blade and ruler. I'm not cutting completely through the paper to the rough dimensions I mentioned previously. Then using a brush with clean water, I'll moisten the cuts with water until it looks like the paper looks saturated. While the paper is wet, I'll start ripping along the perforated line for all 4 sides. I'll distress these edges with a little bit of ink blending for a tea-stained look. I used the Altenew large ink blending brush with Sicilian Amber and Lava Rock dye inks to roughly distress the paper edges with more intensity towards the ends and lighter tints towards the center. To finish this card, I stacked 3 die cuts of the Just Because sentiment from the Essential Sentiment Strips die set. I used the 2-in-1 precision glue to easily get right in between the letter spaces and stacked the paper for a dimensional chipboard type sticker. I used antique gold metallic thread to wrap around the watercolor painting for a vintage feel. Then I foam mounted the entire watercolor panel on top of a craft cardstock card front with my sentiment. I used pure white ink spray to add splatters all over the card front for a vintage fall sunflower card. For my third card example, I'll use some mixed media techniques to get this psychedelic jewel-toned watercolor succulent card. Making this card was really easy, and if you want to, this one is easy to mass produce with slight modifications. To make this card, I'll use a 4th panel of the 9x12 watercolor sheets, that's 4.5 by 6 inches. I'm using this watercolor paper because it holds up to more water than the A2 loose sheets, but has more grit and texture. I'll also use the Linear Pathways Alpha Solid and Outline bundle, and the Mega Succulent stamp set. I'll tape the panel of watercolor paper to my craft mat. I should have used more tape, but oh well. I'll first take this small spray bottle with clean water and liberally wet the paper. While the paper is damp, I'll take my first woodless watercolor pencil and this dull craft blade and scrape the pigment over the paper to make this fine powder. The pigment will immediately diffuse and spread over the wet paper. I'll keep layering water and pigment all over the panel of watercolor paper until I get a saturated background panel. If you love alcohol ink backgrounds, this one is a great alternative for practicing freeform backgrounds and letting go of control in general. I let this dry back completely with the help of my heat tool. If you have a heat laminator, I like to sandwich my panel between two scrap pieces of paper and run it through several times. The pressure and heat will help flatten out your watercolor piece so that it lays flat on your card base. I used the Mega Succulent outline image and white embossing powder to define this really intense Echeveria background. I trimmed the panel down to my final card size of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches as well. You can take this a step further and define shadows between the succulent leaves with the technique shown in the first two card examples, but for this card I'll leave it as is and set it aside for a moment. To make my sentiment, I'll first take a vellum and die cut the word Succa using the Linear Pathways Alpha Solid Die Set. Then I'll take the coordinating outline die and overlay this Lagoon cardstock over the vellum letters. I used the 2-in-1 precision glue pen again to get into these really fine outlines of paper, and this stuff doesn't move if you apply it wet to your cardstock. I adhered the die cut letters to my card front. Then finally, I white heat embossed the sentiment from the Mega Succulent stamp set onto some pink cardstock and foam mounted it above the Linear Pathway Alpha letters so that the sentiment is "So happy for you, Succa." Those are my 3 perfect pairings using the new Woodless 24 watercolor pencils from Altenew. Let me know which one is your favorite in the comments below. If you haven't already, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. All the Altenew materials I used in this card can be found in the description box below. You can check out my perfect pairing series every 2nd and 4th Sunday of the month right here, so I hope to see you again very soon in the next one.
Hello there, crafty friend, Lydia here. Just popping in to say that you can get your daily dose of crafting tips, techniques and tutorials just like this by subscribing to the Altenew YouTube channel. All you need to do is click on that little bell up there and you will never miss a video. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.